Whenever international humanitarian law is ignored, the consequences are devastating. One example is Congo, Brazzaville, a country the size of Italy with a population of around 3.5 million people. After 3 brutal civil wars in the 90s, more than 20,000 people were killed and a third of the population was displaced. The wars in Brazzaville were based on a power struggle between political leaders. They used militia groups, armed men from the streets without military experience to fight each other. It was very difficult for the ICRC to approach them.
To talk with military people already trained is much easier, and we know what to say, you know. But to talk with militias, it's much more difficult. And Brazzaville was a very good spot to contact the ex-civilians who combated here in the 90s.
Christian Pundi was a well-known commander of the Cobras. Since the end of the war in 1999, he runs a bar and lives here with his family. He also works for a UN-sponsored disarmament program, collecting ammunition and weapons to be destroyed.
This is how we destroy these weapons.
It must break your heart to see these guns all breaking up like this.
No, I'm very happy because it's not good if people keep that at home, especially civilians, because if you shoot this at a person, you explode.
For the interview, Christian leads Juan and Kazan to a former battlefield. Immediately, the memories return.
These are the cartridges we shot. Even 7 years after the end of the war, there are still many buried in the ground. We had atrocious encounters here. We've seen it all. We know what war means. It was barbaric. I've seen people cutting heads of wounded enemies, or cutting off arms.
In your view, what was missing?
These people were not properly trained, and they didn't have any education. The combatants grew like mushrooms. Kids, 14 or 15 years old, in a tense situation, it's explosive. We tried to recruit kids to build a resistance. Some people got one-day training. We just showed how to manipulate a gun, how to load and shoot. That was the end of the training.
Do you think strict discipline and sanctions for those who do not respect the laws of war could help fighters to behave differently?
Of course, it was simply barbaric, because people had no training. They didn't see the extent of their crimes because they were often drunk. They smoked and so on. I drank at least 2 bottles of whiskey a day. I was constantly drunk.
On the way home, Christian confesses further details of his traumatic war experiences and of his own actions that went beyond any law.
I bitterly regret because I had to cut off somebody's head. I tell you openly, I cut off somebody's head, but I was under the effect of alcohol. At that time I drank at least 2 bottles of alcohol and one of our friends got killed. The ninjas ripped off his heart. 2 days later, when we killed a ninja, I had to cut off his head and used it as a trophy on my car. I brought the head back in his neighborhood. Everybody saw me with the head of the ninja.
Like Christian, many others in the different militias in Congo, Brazzaville were exposed to extreme violence. Lieutenant Joachim was a commander of the Kokoi militia. He was one of their toughest fighters and primarily in frontline combat. His nickname, Kokoi, was used until 1997. Joachim was part of the government forces. He had heard about international humanitarian law during his initial military training. Later, during the mayhem of the Civil War, he learned to appreciate the important educational role of the ICRC.
First, I have to say the ICRC introduced education in international law to the armed forces. That's really good. Secondly, one really has to improve training with films we show, not only to the army. We have to expand this especially for politicians, since they are responsible for inciting hatred in the population. It's them. They need to be better educated. They need to be shown their responsibilities.
What would you advise other combatants to keep war within limits?
First, you need to be conscious of what you are doing yourself. If one day you encounter a woman who you have raped, you will not be at ease. And I have seen, now today, there are young fighters who were with me. They went mad. But I know they are affected because after the war, they found that even their own families would not accept them. They end up in communities where they had committed atrocities. Inevitably, their minds go mad. They can only calm down with drugs and alcohol.
Those who commit or take part in violations often become the victims of their own behavior, which can affect their mental well-being.
So, the message is to follow the so-called rules of the game.
Persons taking no active part in hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms and those placed out of combat by sickness, wounds and detention, shall be treated humanely.
In a war, certain lines must not be crossed.
Laws of war prohibit murder, mutilation, torture, rape and other forms of sexual violence, hostage-taking, pillage, humiliating treatment and executions without fair trial. Laws of war also oblige each party to care for the wounded and sick.
The enemy on the other side is someone aiming at you, someone wanting to kill you. It's not a woman, a mother, who you are trying to rape. It's not a man who worked hard to build a house which you loot simply out of hatred. That's not good. For the rest of your life, you'll be miserable because these negative images will haunt you forever.